I have with me in the studio this afternoon the distinguished ancient historian Sir Moses Finley. Moses, can you tell us about how your experiences in America influenced what you've done in ancient history?
I think I might as well begin with a point that I was going to make sometime before this we were through. It's a question of how to phrase it in the least offensive way possible. But I think that for me the basic thing was that I had an American and not a British education, by which I'm not talking about particularly the quality of the teaching or anything. I'm talking about the fact that I was brought up in a society in which the one subject degree, the decisions that you make at 14 and 15, what you're going to specialize in, just doesn't exist and is considered anathema. And the result is that when I finally came to ancient history, I'd had a really very broad education, which most of my colleagues here will not have had. It's as crude as that. They will have come up to the university on 3A levels, and in too many cases, maybe a little less so now, the 3A levels were Latin, Greek, and ancient history. And that meant that what they studied from about the ages of 15 to 18 was that. And when they came to the university, they did classics. And if they learned anything else, it was on their own. And I would have thought that's the most important part of my experience.
You began off curiously for a Greek historian with Roman law, or with law. I mean, well, after when you did begin to specialize.
I began to specialize actually as a lawyer. This is my father. I'm sorry. My father was a patriarch who determined all his children's careers for them. And I was to be a lawyer. But I was very young. And so I did a master's degree in American constitutional law. And actually had a job in a law office, General Motors, no less, where I was to work while I went to law school and so on. I got so bored after 6 months, I quit. And got a small scholarship and decided I was going to study history. And the professor of ancient history was a very exciting lecturer. So I went and said I wanted to do ancient history. And he said, how much Latin do you know? Answer, none. How much Greek do you know? Answer, none. And he said, but go away and come back when you know a little.
How long did that take?
A year, I suppose. I never took any courses. I never had a course in Latin or Greek in my life. And that's only possible in the United States, that kind of thing. I'm not sure how possible it is now, but I think it still is.
I think things have become slightly more formalized than
yes,
they
were. But at the graduate level, there's still a very considerable amount of leeway in this respect.
So the implication of at least your life history is that our requirement that classics or ancient historians should have done Latin and Greek before they come to university, and that they can't become professional graduate students in narrow subjects unless they know a lot of Latin and Greek is just unnecessary.
Well, not only unnecessary, it's killing the subject, because you're not getting people to do it.
What about the Depression and the political climate?
Well, that had its effect. Certainly it had its effect. But that would have had its effect whether I had gone on with the Renaissance or constitutional law or whatever. And I got into a small group of graduate students at Columbia who taught themselves in many respects. I mean, whose education went outside the formal curriculum. And we had informal discussion groups and all kinds of things. And as far back as I can remember, but obviously that's not the case, it's only from that point, that we had enormous interest in social theory of all kinds. So that we read, I read Max Weber in 1932, 33, when no ancient historian ever heard his name. By good fortune, I had studied French and German in school, not Latin and Greek, and so I could read Weber, because the translations were all later than that. And we did Pareto and all kinds of people.
So basically you had a social science education.
That's right, but it's a completely informal one, in the sense that it had almost nothing to do with formal schooling.
How did you come to cross the Atlantic and come to England
Oh,
just to settle?
I'm not going to go into a long story because it's too long a story. I lost my job in 1952, 53, I think it was, because of a refusal to cooperate with a congressional committee.
This was under the McCarthyism witch hunt against
Yeah, except it wasn't
communists
the McCarthy committee, it was another committee, but never mind. And I became unemployable. I mean, any number of universities have said to me, we would never have fired you, but we're not hiring you. And then through a series of very complicated coincidences, I had an opportunity to visit Oxford and Cambridge for one term each and give some lectures. And to my astonishment, I was offered jobs in both places without having applied.
What was your first impression? As you already intimated, what some of your impressions of English, the narrowness of English education and of classics in particular. But what were your first impressions when you came to be an ancient historian teaching in Cambridge? What of the professional ambiance?
Well, a number of things. In the first place, I had never been in any institution where there were so many. You know, the largest number that I can think of in any American university on the teaching staff would be 3. And I came to Cambridge at a time when I think there were 8 on the establishment, and then another dozen research fellows who were teaching and all kinds of people. So that one suddenly moved from a minority, very minority subject to what was then a very central subject with an enormous, still in the mid-50s, enormous social cachet, which I don't believe now exists in the same sense. So immediately one was in a totally different kind of environment with, what, 600 students, I suppose, in Cambridge. That's a guess, but that's a fair number.
Rough order of magnitude.
As against 20, you know. And there were some very bright ones.
Can you describe how you saw the intellectual world of the professional ancient historian? I ask this because it appears to me that you've always been seen as, you might not have intended to be, a rebel against, quotes, conventional ancient history.
I probably was, even up to a point, deliberately.
That's what I suspect.
No. Deliberately, but not. That's not easy to formulate, Keith. You know, I didn't sit down and say to myself, "By God, I'm going to revolutionize this subject," or "I'm going to show them up," or anything of the kind. But by the time I came here, I was 40-something or other. You know, I wasn't an instant. I was a reasonably experienced teacher, and very self-confident in that respect. And I knew what I thought, or what I was trying to find out, and nobody bothered me, and so I studied. And by that time, I had become a considerable rebel in writing, though not for a long period. It really only began a couple of years before I came here. But always in a not very self-conscious way. It's a bit hard to pin this down.
The book that made your reputation at that time, I think, was The World of Odysseus.
Well, yes and no. The book that made my reputation with people here was my dissertation, in fact, the Studies in Land and Credit in Ancient Athens. The World of Odysseus, people like Hugo Jones were not very much impressed with. They thought that was pretty pop stuff.
What do you think
passages were translated.
The central point of The World of Odysseus was? I mean, where do you think the intellectually innovative bit came?
2 ways, I suppose, though it's a bit hard to choose or rank them. One, it was the first attempt to treat the Homeric poems as documents exclusively, by which I mean, I would be very specific, I didn't for a moment challenge their poetic quality or anything else. I said, that's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to take these as documents about a society and see whether I can make sense of it. Now, there were such books. I mean, there was Seymour's book, The Age of Homer, or something, 750 pages. But that was, as far as I'm concerned, that was not on. I mean, that was treating it as documents in the kind of way that used to be done with Shakespeare until it was laughed out of court. You know, you took odd sentences and you said, now there, that's an indication of what James I did in 1602 or something. But the second, and I suppose in a sense the more important point, and I think I know how this happened, is it was certainly the first, I think the first attempt on any scale, to treat this as a sociological, or if you may perhaps prefer, an anthropological study, using certain concepts and using parallels. And I suppose, sorry, I suppose the key was the use of Marcel Maus's book on the gifts.
So you saw some of the important actions within the Homeric poems as gift exchange.
That's right. And that was accepted very quickly, I must say. Now, if you ask me, how did I come to this? Not sure.
Did you intend to write the book? I mean,
No, sorry. When I lost my post at Rutgers, for very complicated reasons, the Viking Press offered me a contract to write a history of Greece, popular history of Greece.
You wrote the first chapter?
Move, and this was the first chapter. And by the time I finished it, I went to the press and said, "Look, I've got a small book on this," and they took it. And I never have written history of Greece, by the way. Now, I suppose intellectually, the key figure for me at that point was, in fact, Karl Polanyi, though in an odd way. I had met him just before that, and had begun to work with him. For people who don't know, he had just retired as professor of economic history at Columbia, and had given these lectures for a number of years called The Livelihood of Man. And he was the man, I think, who first showed me what could be done with anthropological literature as a stimulus, as a seedbed of ideas and so on for this period in ancient history, even though he and I then had very sharp disagreements over lots of things.
About the nature of the market, about the importance of...
Well, and also, he picked up from a German anthropologist of the early 20th century named Kurt Turnbull, the notion of the three means of controlling exchange, reciprocity, redistribution, and the market. And he then carried this to a notion that these were the three ways by which a society was integrated. And I never believed that, unfortunately. And
partly because some societies have all three.
And some didn't have any, in the sense in which, the succession just didn't work.
Yeah, he saw it as an evolutionary scheme.
That's right. But I did learn a lot from him in one way or another. And so, in a sense, that's the intellectual stimulus, or the immediate intellectual stimulus. Behind it is, by that time, this was in the early 50s, 20 years of reading all kinds of social science and so on. But I had never mobilized what I thought or what I knew around a central problem until I began to write this book, which I didn't begin to write.
To me, as reader of what you've written and pupil, it seemed to me that what you worked on next was almost for the next 10 years and are still doing work on is slavery.
Well, slavery has a very long, complicated history with me because I was a pupil of Westerman's. And Westerman made much of his career in the last 30 years of his life about writing on ancient slavery. And I was always, in a certain sense, rather critical of things he did, and he knew it. He didn't like it, but he knew it. And I don't know why. It's very hard for me to pinpoint why I wrote anything at any particular point. But very often, and this is certainly a case, I was invited to give a lecture, and I used that as the springboard for something that's been in the back of my mind for a long time, and said, all right, let's do something about it. And in I think it must have been 62, I gave a lecture to the triennial meetings that the classical societies run in this country, and I chose as a subject, the title, in fact, came before I wrote a line, which was Greek civilization based on slave labor. And that blew an enormous amount of...
I think it was 59, but
all right, it could be,
yes,
but it was about that period. And I've been working on it ever since, in one way or another, but very often using lectures as an excuse.
What was the main argument of the paper?
Well, there was a double argument. Partly it was simply a historiographical argument, that there's an enormous amount of debate which rests entirely on the definition of the word based, which is a total waste of time. And in that period, in the 50s, it was further complicated by the fact that saying that a society was based on slave labor was immediately identified as Marxist, and therefore you had to take a position. And the argument there was, that's a waste of time. And if you pose the question outside of that context and ask yourself how essential slavery was in the classical period, in the way society functioned, then it seems to me there's no argument.
The Greek civilization was based on
very simple. That's all the paper said, except that it then tried to develop it by where were the slaves and what roles were they performing and so on. But it was the length of a lecture, 20 pages.
Surely there were lots of issues involved as well, weren't there? In partly the debate about slavery in the ancient world must have had some redundancies with the nature of exploitation, first of all in the American South, secondly in modern industrial
society. Not much then, no. I was the only one who opened this up.
Well, that's right.
Yes, but I didn't open it up nearly as sharply then as I did later.
With slavery and modern ideology.
Well, and even before with the various articles on dependent labor and the fact that slavery, the argument which I developed that slavery is only one form of unfree labor or involuntary labor, and that we, I think I used the phrase that we're captives of an old mythology, that there are only three ways that this can be done. You're either a slave or a serf or a free laborer, and I want to argue that for much of history, the people were none of these.
There's a spectrum of statuses.
There's a spectrum of statuses, and that involved me in the problem of Spartan helots and the colonnade and so on. And then I tried to bring the whole thing together in this short book, which was lectures again. 4 lectures I gave at the Collège de France.
But before that, there was the classic article on Between Slavery and Freedom,
right.
Which was the specification of the spectrum of statuses.
That's right.
To some extent, before you went on to write Slavery and Modern Ideology, and recently, but we've already covered that in a way in dealing with slavery, though you developed ideas in Slavery and Modern Ideology, which weren't there in the was of Greek civilization based on slave labor. What do you hold to be particularly important
in that book?
In that book.
Well, the thing that's made the biggest noise, of course, is the first chapter, which is a very highly negative, not negative, a highly nasty chapter about the historiography of the subject. It's the longest chapter in the book, and the book gives it the title. The other 3 chapters are an attempt in a very schematic way to present the origins of slavery, the behavior pattern that emerges, and the decline of slavery. And it's very schematic. The whole book is 4 lectures, somewhat enlarged.
Shall we talk about the decline of slavery? Because
I wish I knew what to say about it, yeah.
Well, you and I, we both know some of the difficulties about deciding whether it ended, how it ended, but doctrinaire Marxists at least have a clear view.
Excuse me, yes. But when you pin them down, they have 6 to 8 centuries that they have to cover, and they have no idea how to deal with it.
Between the
3rd, 4th century and Charlemagne.
So the transition from slavery to serfdom.
Well, my argument is the transition that takes 500 years is not a very useful concept. That's all.
So there's not a straight transmission from...
I don't believe there is at all, no.
Serfdom begins...
There's a Frenchman named Pierre Ducas who's now argued all over again. In fact, there was a revolution of the slaves, which he can't find, but he posits it very vigorously and at considerable length. But I just, and therefore I'm in trouble, because I don't... See, behind that problem of the transition is a Marxist theory of social stages, in which each one grows out of its predecessor, and grows out of the womb of the predecessor. You use whatever metaphor you choose out of these metaphors. And I can't find this one. That's all.
You can't find the conflict between slavery and serfdom in the same period, in the 4th century AD or in the 3rd century AD.
I mean, you do it if you do what Geoffrey St. Croix does and simply declare that something is serfdom. But the difference between what he insists on calling serfdom and what the 11th century or the 9th century thought was of serfdom is so enormous that I don't see this as an acceptable method at all. And once you abandon that, then you're in fact in trouble with the whole lineal evolution scheme.
But what about you in the 60s, in the early 60s at least, published a number of, I'd call them rather technical articles. I mean, I think you would say on technical innovation in the ancient world. Why do you think that, I mean, what do you think the main argument of the paper was?
Well, the main argument of that paper was to try to examine why technology remained on such a low level, why there was a lack of inventiveness, a lack of interest in it, and why, in fact, there was a divorce between technology and inverted commas, pure science.
Why was it that the Greeks and Romans were so technically static?
I can't answer that in that form. I've never said this, but I'm not the only one who's thought this, that the problem is the other way around. The problem is why at one point in history did people stop being technically static and do what happened in the Western world from whenever we want to date it, 12th century on. What are the forces that drive people to innovate, to think of new ways of transporting things or manufacturing things or whatever, instead of just doing the way they always were done?
That easily leads, and I'm sure you can see it coming, that in much economic history we tend to ask the question, why was there no ancient industrial revolution?
That's right.
And in some way that's what you dealt with in the ancient economy.
That's right.
Because I think you were there saying that the ancient economy was quintessentially different from
the
modern economy. Yeah. Is that what the main argument?
Of course it is. Of course it is. And I still believe that.
What do you think the other arguments of the ancient economy were?
Well, it was an attempt not just to say what it wasn't. It was an attempt within, I admit, insufficient limits, or with excessive limits, rather, to say that what's an alternative way of looking at what motivates people and what drives them, and why are they able to do it this way rather than that way. And that does come back, at least in part, though not exclusively, to the problem of subject labor. That, I believe that the psychology of a society, and I'll qualify this in a minute, which has a captive labor supply, or a labor supply over which it exercises non-economic compulsion, is going to operate psychologically in a different way from a society which is primarily compels by economic means. Now, the qualification is the American South, and I think the answer to that is that the American South has a massive slave labor, but within a whole world which is already, and enmeshed in a trading relations and so on with a world which is already entirely based on free labor.
So in the American South, the form of production is partly determined by the existence of the American North.
That's right. Or Europe.
Or Europe. But within the ancient world, economic production is determined by status and by the desire for ostentatious
and the
consumption.
people with whom they're in contact are in one way or another in the same position.
Can you say something about the importance of status? Because for a quondam Marxist, or someone who was thought to be a Marxist, your desertion of class analysis.
I know, but look, I have been called everything in terms of Marxist. My favorite phrase is one Badian used of me. He called me an anti-Marxist. And I never was a Marxist in the sense that the Science and Society people, for example, to take the American Journal, which has now got a run of 40 years or something, survived all periods. I was never a Marxist in that sense, ever.
I wasn't intent to label you.
No, I mean, sorry, therefore, I haven't abandoned anything that I never was. I now think that in the ancient world, class in the strict sense that I think is the strict Marxist sense. Other people deny this, but then I think they're just inventing their own definitions to save the phenomena. But that in that sense, it is a secondary phenomenon. And that status, which I admit is a vague word, is more important. In motivating, in determining the behavior, the choices that people make of what they will do and what they will not do, where they will devote their energies and their resources. And to deny the existence of classes is a nonsense, but that's not very interesting.
But you're saying that they weren't important determinants?
Well, they weren't central, in the sense that the history of all existing society is a history of class struggle. I do not believe that. It's very simple. And I think you only rescue that by very tricky playing around with terminology.
I mean, would you think, for example, that slaves had a consciousness of a collective good in the ancient world?
Certainly not. Certainly not.
So they're not a class for themselves.
And not only that, the range of slaves and economic range, wealth range, status range of slaves and freedmen is enormous in the ancient world. Between the kind of people at one point were almost running the machinery of the Roman Empire, and slaves working under chains on a large estate. They have their common legal position category, but in every other respect they're enormously different. You know, they have a spectrum just like any other sector of the population.
And in a sense, even in the Roman Empire, do you think that the economy was integrated, that you can use modern analytical concepts at all usefully?
I don't, but some people do.
I know I do, and I know you don't.
I don't.
I failed to persuade you.
No, you have failed to persuade me, but all right, that's mutual. That's a mutual failure. No, I don't believe it. I don't believe that any economy on a large scale, world scale, whatever you want, is integrated before the 19th century, and that requires the international capitalist market. There's an international market in the Roman Empire, of course, but how much does it determine behavior? How much does it?
Its level of intrusion is so slight at the village level or even at the town level that it's a thin veneer of sophistication.
And therefore, I don't believe it's really an integrating force in the society.
In recent years, you've worked on methodology.
Yeah.
And the last book is Ancient History.
Lectures again.
Methods and models and methods.
Evidence and models.
Evidence and models. And before that, in the essay on the city, you dealt with the historiographical tradition of how the city had been treated in ancient history. What do you think the central message is?
Two. One is part of my old, long-standing complaint about, and I've used the phrase, the privileged position of Greek and Latin, and it extends to the privileged position of anything written in Greek and Latin, which for some curious reason, though nobody will admit this, is subject to the ordinary rules and canons of judgment. So that you can write absolute rubbish in Greek, and somehow it has to be rescued because it's in Greek. Whereas if the same rubbish is written in French, then you say, well, what do you expect? It's French.
Rubbish,
yeah, it's the French, you know. Yes. That's it. And the second is that a complete skepticism about a very large amount of what ancient historians think they know, when I doubt it very much. I don't believe that it's epistemologically possible, and certainly not with the kind of evidence we have. And therefore, my argument is that you have got to work with models, recognizing that a model is never the truth, or reality, or whatever word you want, but is simply an attempt to simplify the problems to a point where you might make a better approximation. Now, that's very hard doctrine for any historian to accept. I don't pretend for a moment that it isn't. And yet it also hasn't been proved very easy for them to attack it. The best they can do is to say, yes, but. And then start stringing out the exceptions. You know, and the answer to that is there are always exceptions. That's of no interest. But unless you do more than just string out exceptions in a kind of discrete listing of isolated cases, then I come back to the whole point I made before. What's the point of the exercise? Now, that's what the book's about.
But I thought there was something about your lectures which was socially subversive, that part of the reason why so many people came was not only were the lectures about ancient history, but also they were taking up moral and political issues which were contemporary relevant.
That's right. That's right.
Do you think that's
that is correct?
A proper task of the historian?
Well, how subversive socially they were, I don't know. But if he hasn't got that task, what the hell is he doing?
I agree.
I mean, sorry.
But it's not in the self-definition of most.
I know, but if he's just accumulating some more dates, and I have a favorite title of an archive which actually exists, of 40 pages, called 22 or 23. And the whole article, 40 pages, is whether something happened, I can't remember what it was, in 23 or 22 BC.
I'm sure something happened in each year.
No, something specific. I can't remember what it was now.
I see.
Whether Augustus did something in 22 or 23. And if that's what the historian's doing, then I don't see why anybody's paying him to do it.
Do you think that you and your followers have in any way managed to change the normal way in which ancient history is practiced? You may not have been setting out to campaign against, but the impact was one of a campaign, wasn't it? You were setting up a new school.
School, all right. The difficulty is that there are too many ancient historians, and any statement saying ancient historians now do this is easily falsified. But I don't have any doubt that not just, less perhaps in this country, but certainly in France and Italy and even in Germany and Scandinavia, there is now an increasing number of ancient historians who do more of what I call proper historical writing. Now, I'm not suggesting that I did it. It was because of me. But I'm prepared to accept that I have some responsibility for it. Whether they represent anything but a minority in the field, I doubt. Because it's a bit the hard way to do things. It's really much easier to do 40-page articles on 22 or 23 BC. It really is. You know, if you have the stamina, and in the United States you get grants all over the place, and you thank 16 foundations for enabling you to do this. And if you have the stamina and so on, you produce a bibliography like that, you offend nobody, and you're acknowledged as a good scholar. It's easier. So, I'm sorry to be very cynical, but I'm not very cynical, but I sound very cynical.
And looking back over teaching ancient history, what are the things that you regret, that you would have liked to have done? Do you regret having left America?
No. But look, I haven't an ounce of that kind of funny patriotic feeling. I regret having been driven out, so to speak. I wasn't driven out, but driven out in the sense that I couldn't get employment at what I was doing. But I've enjoyed 30 years here very much. And I think my work has been better for this environment.